Hello, my name is Timothy Bentley, and today I have with me Alyssa Teteris. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Alyssa Teteris. I teach 11th grade at College View High School. I'm in the science department, currently teaching biology and AP biology.
Wonderful. And today we are going to be talking about some pedagogical methods for teaching multilingual learners mostly focused in STEM classrooms. So, Alyssa, in your experience as a high school teacher, what sort of things are done for multilingual learners, and what is your experience in your classroom?
We have a very high percentage of our population at College View who are designated English learners, which means that by law they have low English proficiency and therefore are required to receive additional services as part of their schooling. And so that can look a couple of ways. It looks like making sure our teachers are trained in best practices for instructing multilingual learners, and there's also English language development specialists who co-teach in some of our classes.
So it seems like at the high school level, there's quite a bit of thought surrounding this, both like required by law and just for an effort to help you students. Yeah. And so comparing that to a collegiate level, it seems, at least my perception would have been, that very few of these same measures and protections are in place for multilingual learners in college. I think maybe the first part of that is because it's assumed at a college level everyone is going to be able to speak English as a prerequisite for going to the college. Mm-hmm. But there's certainly still going to be a wide range of language proficiency between students, which could affect their quality of learning. Did you see anything at all like this at college?
Yeah, I can think of a few courses where things like visuals were highly used. And to your point, when you said you assume that most people coming to the college will speak English, that's one thing we look at with multilingual learners is the ability to speak does not necessarily translate to the ability to write and to share your ideas and to have that deep learning. You also need to be concerned about listening, writing, and reading as the other modes of language. So even just assuming speaking English is not going to be enough to support some students.
In those classrooms at college where there's maybe more visuals used which would support these learners, do you feel like that was done intentionally to support multilingual learners, or just as a coincidental part of that professor's teaching style?
Probably mostly the latter, being the teaching style just being more geared towards those visuals.
Right.
This tends to happen more in spaces where it's I'm thinking about chemistry or things you can't see the atoms, and so even for someone who's not trying to learn English and learn content at the same time, these are difficult concepts that you really need to draw out and think out with visuals.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, because this is not a prerequisite for being a professor at a college level. Even having an understanding or a knowledge of what sort of accommodations they might need to make, and there are no institutional level protections in place for multilingual learners.
I also wonder, a lot of my professors spoke English as a second language themselves, right, and would have had to learn content and English at the same time. And so I wonder how much of their current teaching style is because they have never, they didn't receive those supports, and maybe they don't have the current metacognition of what ended up eventually helping them get to this level of scientific understanding that they have. I think that's a common thing I've seen in higher education is professors just teaching the way that they were taught, because there is no sort of training that goes into becoming a teaching professor specifically.
Yeah, definitely. So in the scientific literature surrounding teaching multilingual learners, there's a common consensus around a few things about how multilingual learners perform in the classroom. And so I'm going to share a few of these with you to start. So for multilingual learners, the math achievement highly correlates with their proficiency in the language of instruction. And controlling for language proficiency, multilingual learners will outperform monolingual ones in math, as those multilingual learners are able to fully draw on both of their multiple languages to help them make sense of math. But in most cases, where if a multilingual learner does not have full equal proficiency in the language of instruction, a student's interpretation and processing of mathematical concepts will often occur in a student's first language, which can lead to some problems like word problems being particularly difficult, especially if they are sort of in abstract situations. Enforcing The expression of thought in the language of instruction can tend to inhibit mathematical thinking for these students. And so for an instructor, just allowing students to switch their own thinking can be productive instead of trying to regulate that. Multilingual learners often will process math in the language that they first learned, or arithmetic. So if they first learned it in another language when they were young, even if they're much older and learned much more math in a second language, they will still tend to think in the first language while they are problem solving. Upon hearing some of those points, do you feel like this reflects your own experience in the classroom, and do you have any first thoughts?
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense for processing. I know allowing them to process in that first language can be incredibly helpful, even though I don't speak Vietnamese. I speak very little Spanish, which is the most common languages in my classroom right now. And allowing them to talk to each other in that language, even though I'm sure they've called me names behind my back, but like allowing them to process in other languages is incredibly important. And I've seen a lot of growth when students support each other in their home languages.
So yeah, one thing that I was seeing while reading through some of this research is that a lot of these problems can stem from the fact that when you're learning a new language, however that learning is happening, is probably going to be prioritized towards language that you can use in common spaces to get through everyday life.
Yeah.
And that the language used in technical fields in STEM classrooms, that can be thought of as like a different register of a language that isn't taught when you're first learning that language. So even if a student has pretty high proficiency in English, they likely will not have learned a lot of technical language or not learned language in the context of a technical setting.
Yeah, I think too about like even for students who do have English as their first language, it can be incredibly important to use some of the exact same best practices to help them develop vocabulary and help them develop that content knowledge.
Definitely, yeah. So I think in a college setting where most professors and the wider institutions aren't aware of how to teach to multilingual learners, that's maybe a good entry point to try to improve their instruction, is just to encourage the use of methods that would benefit everyone.
Like universal design.
Yeah, so this would be following like the concept of universal design, and that will probably be easier to spread across teaching professors than giving them a list of points for multilingual learners, which some of them might think that they don't really have any multilingual learners, or may think that it's not important for them to have to accommodate that.
That was the other thing I was thinking about, was how much value do we place as an institution on making sure that our classes are accessible and that we're celebrating the diversity? Like having 2 or more languages to draw from is a huge asset in understanding the world.
Okay, I think next I'm going to go over some of these methods and recommendations for teaching multilingual learners in classrooms. Avoid jargon where possible, or explain phrases where contextual knowledge is key to understanding. Be explicit about expectations around plagiarism. Be clear in your instructions for course assignments. Be willing to adjust your pedagogical approaches. You can support multilingual learners by demonstrating that vocabulary can have multiple meanings, like those words like table and quarter, which will have a different specific meaning in a mathematical context. Encourage students to offer bilingual or multilingual support to each other. As you were talking about, like letting students talk to each other in their native language can really help. That phenomenon of like code switching in the classroom was studied explicitly, and although there can be a perception or a misunderstanding that code switching is a sign of deficiency, that someone will only do that when they're unable to speak in English, the research around it shows that code switching is not primarily a reflection of language proficiency or proficiency like in the content knowledge, and it's more a tool that these students have to express their thinking and processing in a different way to support themselves. As you talked about earlier on, providing more visuals can be very beneficial instead of keeping everything within the realm of written language. And that is something that will both help students understand what you're trying to teach, and for those multilingual learners, that helps master and connect vocabulary between languages.
But one thing to add to the vocabulary point in pre-teaching important vocab is if you want students to be able to talk about their learning, which is very important. Humans do a lot of our processing by talking about things. you need to teach them how to pronounce things as well. And so now they all know, in addition to like, the visuals I have on the board, how to say that word so that if they are trying to reference it later, they know how to pronounce it, and they're not worried as much about the pronunciation.
I feel like I can relate to that experience of in some technical reading, sometimes there's a name of a complex polymer or something, and my brain will just pass over that word, and then later on, I can't recall what the name where it was because I never really read it and tried to process that.
Yeah. Another way that this would be beneficial, not just for multilingual learners, but for all students in the classroom. The other one I think I saw was providing exemplars, examples of finished work, especially in science and math spaces where it sounds different to write a paper on that complex polymer than it does to, write a newspaper article, write a blog post, write an email to your colleague, like the more typical academic English that is taught to newcomers. So even just like that, structurally, our writing is different as scientists, as mathematicians, as engineers, and so showing what that looks like and even breaking it down for students, being like, okay, every time I write an introduction, I say, we did blank because blank so we could figure out blank, right? Giving like it's called a language frame, or there's a brick and mortar analogy for like teaching language in that way of your bricks are all of your vocab words, your polymers, your integrals, etc. And your mortar is like how we put those things together, the transition phrases, the prepositions. But yeah, I really liked all those. Pretty aligned with what we do in high schools, and I see benefiting students and would definitely benefit them moving into university spaces.
Cool. Do you have any final thoughts?
I would love in university spaces to see more of these discussions happening. Like I was really excited about the CTC program like starting up because I do think there's a lot of room for improvement upon our systems, and there's a lot of people who've been doing that work for years. Like there's tons of pedagogical research out there, and I really hope that we can start taking things out of the realm of like strict pedagogy. I'm hoping that it moves out across all of these spaces. We can improve our system and hopefully become more celebratory of different ways to process, different ways to present information as we go forward.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.